Hey, Melissa. Testing one, two, three. Testing one through two, three. Testing. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Cool, 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 cool. Can you guys see my autism PowerPoint by chance? Also very cool. Okay, I'm going to wait another couple minutes here and then we'll go ahead and get started. I'm trying to figure out all this high technology here. I'm an old school professor. I use sock puppets and chalk and dry erase boards. All right, I think there's a few more that are joining right now. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and get started, and I'll try to go ahead and grow some extra arms so I can do a few other things on a few other minimized screens. But I want to welcome you guys to the Academic Success Center's celebration of actually worldwide Autism Awareness Month. And this is an exciting personal time for me as a researcher and a college professor because I have had a lot of experience working with autistic individuals. And I am going to kind of infuse some of those experiences tonight in this presentation from kind of a third person perspective and just kind of inform some of the pedagogy and some of the research that I'm going to go ahead and show you guys on the subsequent slides. So bear with me here just real quick. I'm going to assume that my colleagues and other people can kind of help me out if I'm on the ceiling or you guys can't see me or whatever. Just let me go ahead and know. And we'll go ahead and make some adjustments here. Like I said, high technology is not necessarily my thing. I do enjoy it, but I have more talented colleagues that can kind of help me out on that end. But one thing that is my thing is research and actually teaching. Pretty pretty excited, pretty intrinsically motivated to do those types of things. And so I want to share some of those passions with you. So like I said, let's go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and flip through some of these slides right here. And I'm a professor that doesn't necessarily read words from a slide. I use them kind of as talking points and just kind of inform my monologue, if you will. So I want to just go ahead and let me see. Yeah, we'll just go ahead and again, let me know if things aren't kind of flowing from your end. So I'm going to start really quickly with presentation objectives here. And the idea is I want to cover autism from unique angles that other people wouldn't necessarily think of. And because most of us in this room are educators at some level, right? We all have kind of a vested intrinsic interest in pedagogy and effective learning and teaching strategies, both for students and ourselves as educators and teachers. And that's one of the things as a college professor down here in the Atlanta area, I really have a lot of motivation in, and that's the art of teaching. I do believe it's an art. I believe that not every professor is a good teacher. Wife, love her to death. She's a professor at Georgia State as well. Not necessarily an intrinsically trained and motivated teacher. She's more of a grant writer, more of getting into kind of the service component of higher education, but I love to teach. So I've kind of constructed this presentation from the perspective of widening some teaching nets and looking at autism through kind of a prism. So the prism that we're going to use here is really quickly, I want to go over the epidemiology, right, and the diagnostic criteria and some of the manifestations, behavioral, verbal, nonverbal of autism. And again, I'm going to pepper in some anecdotes, third person, with some different grade levels of students that I've had the fortunate pleasure to get to know and to kind of understand a little bit of the autistic mind and how that is affected by education. As a science nerd, I do really feel compelled to discuss kind of what I call the biological underpinnings of autism. There are a number of them, right? Some of them are genetic related, some of them are metabolically related, and some are actually familial and environmentally related. So I'm going to talk about some of those underpinnings and kind of what happens inside the brains of autistics and what types of things that's happening in the brains of autistics can ultimately be manifested and expressed through autism. And then I want to get into some of the sociological aspects of autism. This is something that I think a lot of people don't understand. This goes above and beyond stigmatization, right? It goes above and beyond a stigma that some people in culture might have against autistic individuals. This goes into more of, what happens within and across different types of cultures and how cultural affiliation and subcultural affiliation look at autism. And then the last thing I want to do in the last couple bullet points, if you can read these here, is I want to kind of get into the educational realm a little bit more specifically. And I want to focus in on the K through 12 in bullet point number 4 and talk about different learning styles. And most of us here in this virtual kind of group, I think are somewhat familiar, if not very familiar, with different learning styles of students across levels of education. And then the last bullet point I want to specifically get into is I want to look at autism through the prism of higher education. All right. So I myself, you all yourselves are in higher education. So I kind of want to talk about autistic individuals that we may have or have had past tense or will have future tense and some of the different things that we can kind of keep in mind. All right. So what I want to do just real quick here though, you are still in, okay. Let's see. Can we see this one? Am I still on the title slide? I'm assuming that, let's see. Oh, that's nice. Such a fancy little, such a fancy little slide I was talking about too. All right. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, don't want to do that. All right, I'm going to try something else because I have far too many boxes open. All right. Okay, let's see. Am I on my outline slide right now? And we go. You can click on the next slide. Can everybody see my presentation objectives? Or am I still kind of out in left field? No, oh no. Okay, let me figure out what's going on here because I'm able to kind of toggle through my individual slides. Let's see. That's just vectors right there. Okay, so I'm assuming that nothing is happening as I'm flipping through these slides right here. Is this correct? That nothing is happening? Let's see, let me get into my chats here. Oh, it's the book looking button at the bottom. Oh, okay. If we're late to this, then I want to just apologize for this. I'm a sock puppet kind of professor. So this is fairly new to me, but we'll get it all figured out here though. I have confidence. Let's see. Want that. Share screen. That must have been my lovely mug right there. All right. How about this one right here? Can we see anything here by chance? Oh, we can see it. All right. So I'm going to roll kind of junior varsity here just real quick. I don't know, Melissa, if this is the edits of kind of what you had originally sent me, but I think it's kind of negligible in terms of the content. So hopefully we can kind of get caught up on that right there. So I'm going to ask one more time and make sure that everybody is on board with seeing the same thing I am. Is everybody seeing the presentation objectives? Oh, nice. Self-efficacy back up. Okay. So again, what I want to do real quick here is, again, I talked about these five kind of different perspectives, and I want to kind of tread in the water of science and then tread in the water of sociology and then tread in the water of psychology. That's kind of what I was spewing about here the last 5 minutes or so. So one thing we all have to kind of understand about autism is it is a spectrum disease, all right? And on the spectrum, you have varying levels of affliction, all right? And not just affliction and disruption of the brain and kind of the processing within the brain, but certainly you have a spectrum in terms of the verbal and the nonverbal manifestations of the disorder. So I was one of those guilty parties way back in the day of labeling autism as its own discrete and distinct neurological / developmental disease, all right? And I was really quickly kind of educated and really quickly motivated by carrot and stick to kind of look at the kind of the spectrum of the disorder. And again, I'm going to inform a little bit of this by talking about some students that I've kind of had. So these students have reinforced the idea that, you know, when you go and you see them function, especially in an educational environment, they can function on different kinds of spectrums of affliction and different kinds of spectrums of manifestation. So what is autism spectrum disorder? Well, obviously autism spectrum disorder, is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So the idea here is that this is a disorder that is multivariate. It's a disorder that, again, has various components on the spectrum of behavioral manifestations and then neurological changes, all right? Most people, and I want to say the research that I've done on the topic, about 80 to 85% of individuals are diagnosed within the first 3 years of life. And typically the diagnosis flows from about 18 months up to about 36 months, all right? But we do have people getting diagnosed later on in their childhood years, up to and including ages 5 through 8. So even though the research will tell you that, well, autism is mostly diagnosed within the first 3 years of life, not necessarily the case, all right? There are a number of different reasons for that, and we'll kind of get into that. But again, autism as a spectrum disorder, as a neurodevelopmental disorder, has multiple causes. It's what we call multivariate, right? There are a number of different variables that coalesce and combine to cause autism. So that's kind of one of the things we're going to explore a little bit tonight as well, is just what are some of those multiple causes, right? And how do those causes act? How do they function within and around each other to change the way brains are built and the way brains perceive, integrate, and express stimuli? Okay, so I've kind of covered the last 3 and 4 points here. My takeaway from this particular slide to you all, you haven't heard it described as different mapping of the brain. Well, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about brain imaging in this particular study. And what we know as kind of brain researchers is you can look at different areas of the brain and they will stain or they will metabolize at more or less degrees, depending upon whether that brain is, quote, considered normal or whether that brain is considered autistic. So yes, I do believe you can overlay neurological mapping processes onto the brains of both autistics and non-autistics, and you can see metabolic changes in different areas of the brain. So I do believe if you're talking about mapping brains that way, then yeah, absolutely. Okay, so hopefully that kind of made sense to you guys a little bit. All right, so symptomatic expression profiles. So this is kind of the main symptom areas of autistic spectrum disorder, right? So with all the research that I've done, what I've heard people kind of go back to over and over and over again is most of the symptom areas, the expression of the neurodevelopmental disorders can happen in the social interaction sphere, okay? And I'm going to tell you some stories from that perspective. The social interaction sphere, and that includes both verbal and nonverbal communication, but then also the intrapersonal sphere as well. So think of the social interactive perspective as interpersonal, right? So I'm going to go ahead and type this in right here. Hopefully I can also use this as well. Interpersonal is just interactions between people. So one of the 2 main symptom areas is what we call interpersonal, all right? And that is the social interactive component, right? Verbally, non-verbally. The other one on the right, what I want you guys to see here is this is what we call the intrapersonal sphere. Ooh, intrapersonal. There we go. Right. So there we're talking about within the individual. So what is unique within the individual right there, not necessarily how does that individual react to other individuals in time space, but what goes on in the minds of autistic individuals, again, on the spectrum. So here we're looking principally at repetitive behaviors. And these can be macro behaviors, what I call macro behaviors. These can be behaviors that have kind of profound consequences in terms of behavior response, right? So the response can be a little bit more on the macro side in terms of a larger level response, so a noticeable response. And then it can also be a micro-personal response, and that is, it's something that the person is doing within themselves that doesn't have a lot of transference to the outside world, right? So other people can't necessarily see those repetitive behaviors. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm talking about here in these 2 spheres is one is macro personal or macro social, the interpersonal side, and one is microsocial or the intrapersonal side. And then what I've tried to kind of explain here is in the intrapersonal side, you have macro behaviors that are largely seen by objective others in environments and stuff that's more micro-personal where it's kind of kept to the individual and expressed within the individual, if that makes sense. So let me just go ahead and one of the things I'm going to have to do, I'm not too sure on the whole admissions thing. I'm trying to admit as we're kind of going along here. Again, one of the things, I'm kind of a single channeled individual. So for all of us electronic people who are doing dude, it's not that hard. Hang with me. All right. So some of the clinical symptoms of autism spectrum disorders. And here, if you were all my students down here, in Georgia, what I would say is, well, I would like my students to know the differences between signs and symptoms, right? A lot of the students I teach down here are pre-medical students, and I'm always in their heads about understanding the difference between a clinical sign and a clinical symptom, right? And I think it kind of takes a few minutes and deserves a few minutes of its own, right? But the idea here is that a sign is something that you can objectively see in other people, right? So I don't know if you guys can see my cheery face on the screen here, but one of the things I'm doing a little bit, because I'm under my wife's old chandelier at the dining table, is I have a little sweating going on, all right? So that right there is a clinical sign. It's objectively verifiable in that people can see this process within me, all right? That's a clinical sign. Someone's got cyanosis, their skin is blue, right? Someone is bleeding, we can see it. It's dark red, it's bright red, it's arterial, it's venous bleeding, all right? And then that's different than a symptom, right? So a sign is objective, like a stop sign, everybody can see it, but a symptom is more subjective. A symptom is something that someone has to communicate to you, all right? I feel like is how I tell my students. I feel tired, I feel hungry, all right? You can't necessarily see that out as an objective other person looking at that individual. So what I want to kind of pound on real quick is that people on the spectrum, people on the autism spectrum have both clinical signs and clinical symptoms that they manifest. And as a clinician, one of the things that I just kind of have a pet peeve on, and I don't know about you all, but my students kind of, they get this confused sometimes, is everybody labels everything as a symptom, all right? So I'm kind of looking at this range of symptoms right here, and these are kind of the main symptoms and signs that I have boiled down, because there's a lot of them, and I boiled them all down into the signs and symptoms that were expressed most often by autistic individuals, okay? So I would argue that lack of facial expression, which we will see that, and what I'm talking about with facial expressions is someone sees an event, and it's a horrific event, or it's an event that angers them, or it's an event that evokes some kind of emotive response, some kind of emotional response, but they don't have the appropriate human expression to reflect the event that they just saw. Okay, so that's called a lack of facial expressions, and I don't think that's hard to understand. But what I would impress upon you all is that facial expressions are signs, not symptoms. Now, I know this is kind of, semantics, but it's something I think as educated individuals who are in the business of educating and helping students kind of challenge themselves educationally and grow as academicians, I think it would kind of behoove us to make sure that people are kind of on the same page. So my bottom line on this particular slide is these are a collection of signs and symptoms that people on the autism spectrum manifest, all right? So reduced eye contact, differences in body language, lack of facial expressions, all right? You guys can read the rest. Again, I'm not a huge proponent of reading to people from slides, all right? That's just not quite my thing. I just kind of use them and I talk about certain features on an individual slide. But right around here, I want to tell you guys, I want to kind of press pause, and I want to tell you guys about some research I did for this presentation. So one of the things that I do is I go into a local high school here in the North Atlanta area, and I have the opportunity to go into the high school and do science tutoring there as well, all right? And it's just kind of something I do every so often, and I'm a mentor for high school students, and I'm an advocate for higher education in high school students. And so I go in and I mentor them, and I do different kinds of tutoring services for them. So for this presentation, I went into it was a mild to moderate SPED class, special education class. And there were about 5 or 6 individuals that had been diagnosed somewhere along the spectrum. And so what I did was I got the appropriate clearances and the appropriate research, HIPAA manifestations and that kind of stuff. And I just kind of sat down and I just kind of chilled with them a little bit. And I said, hey, let's just talk about your struggles as an autistic student, right? Sophomore, junior, senior year of high school. I mean, what do you feel on a daily basis? What kind of struggles do you have in learning information and retaining information? And so there was one individual that I was kind of interviewing, or that I was just kind of chilling with, talking to, And as I asked them about 5 or 6 different questions, the one thing that I thought was unique about this particular individual was he never looked at me in the eye when I talked to him. Okay, he looked away, and it seemed like he was kind of looking off in the distance somewhere through a wall. So as I was talking to him, he very much had reduced eye contact. But when he responded to my question, the interesting thing was he looked directly at me, just like I'm looking into the camera right now. So that was kind of an interesting perspective for me to see in an autistic individual. He did, in fact, manifest reduced eye contact, but it was kind of a nuanced effect. When he's a recipient information, look somewhere else. When he's the purveyor of information, look directly at you, look right into your soul, and talk to you. All right. So that's something that kind of struck me in that moment, was that kind of that disparity. Okay. Another thing that happened a lot is something that we call echolalia. And echolalia is kind of doing a repeating sound, and it could be a sound that doesn't necessarily make sense. All right, I'm going to go ahead and type this into the chat box as well. I think some people maybe in here have heard of this before. Echolalia, right? So the idea here is they're kind of monosyllabic, maybe bisyllabic kind of word sounds, all right? But they're kind of nonsensical, all right? So you do hear a lot of that in autistic individuals as well. Next slide. All right, so next slide, what I have here is I'm just kind of going to go ahead and touch on the risk factors for autism. And there are a number of different risk factors here that I found in my research. All right, the most prominent risk factor, I will say, I'm going to break this down a little bit further, is the genetic part of this. All right, and if you look at percentage of variance, if any of us know about percentages of variance in here, and it's just what is the percentage that explains a particular phenomenon, all right? And so when you look at what explains the most aspects of developing autistic spectrum disorders, genetics accounts for the greatest variance, all right? If you have a genetic predisposition to developing autism, then in terms of probabilities, you are more likely to develop it, if that makes sense to you all. So here are some of those genetic variables that increase the chance of autism. And the ones on this page right here that I found have the highest degree of variance, predictive variance, is having a sibling on the spectrum, all right, having older parents, and then having certain kind of genetic alterations that happen to kind of someone's DNA and their nucleotide sequences, such as Fragile X syndrome. So my point here is that when we look at the risk factors of autism in terms of what things have the most weight to them, what things can point to the developing of autism, what I'm trying to impress upon you here is that the genetic side of this seems to carry the most weight in terms of future development, right? So again, having a sibling, right? Having certain chromosomal alterations on the X chromosome specifically. And then obviously experiencing complications at birth as well. So, you know, that would be something that could elicit some type of neurological trauma. And that trauma could become manifest over a period of time later as somewhere on the spectrum, if that makes sense to you guys. All right. So how is it diagnosed? And again, this is something as a clinician that I'm kind of aware of when it comes to diagnosing any kind of condition, medical, psychiatric, whatever. All right. There are a lot of reasons why things are and are not diagnosed. All right. Sometimes it's just people don't know any better and they consider this part of normal growth and development in a growing brain. And so they don't necessarily have all those red flags ticked to the point where they will go into a clinical environment and say, hey, my child is starting to express these different behavioral characteristics, and I find this bothersome. Therefore, I think I want to go ahead and get this person or my child worked up, or the clinician believes, yes, it's time to work your child up for these particular things, right? But we do have kind of a battery of paper pencil tests and checklists that can be used as screening tools. But what I want you to see here is most of these, and these are the three most prominent right here. two of the three are directly geared for toddlers and infants. Okay, so we're gearing that more for the under 3 to 4 age group. All right, so when you look at what screening measures might be there for older individuals, all right, then there isn't a lot of psychologically, methodologically validated approaches for that. It becomes a little bit more objective in terms of I'm seeing these behaviors and I want to go ahead and explore the origins of these behaviors. But in terms of the younger individuals, and again, that's the cohort that is most likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's, these are the three accepted kind of gold star screening measures. And so here I have an example of some type of questions that you would ask a parent within this particular modified checklist for autism as it relates to toddlers. And so here, again, they're asking parents to rate in this yes, no kind of perspective. Does your child enjoy doing X, Y, or not doing X, Y, or do they do X, Y, or Z thing? And again, I have a hard time with this as a scientist because there's all sorts of shades of gray. And just because a parent looks at, well, yeah, does my child imitate you? Well, okay, to an extent, yes, we know that the developing brain learns by behavioral modeling, right? We understand that. We understand that children have to see and they have to repeat what they see done in front of them. But it's there's shades of gray in that some children acquire information and are motivated to express that information and imitate that information in different ways. So I don't like the whole dichotomy of yes, no. Sometimes I believe that there are shades of gray in between yes or no. And so I think it's not quite as simple as a lot of clinicians like to believe it is. All right. And so how do you start to tease out some of those nuances right here? Because some of these I would think, yeah, I mean, children or toddlers in this particular case might be a little bit more slowly adaptable to specific things like climbing on stairs. Just because a child does not climb on stairs doesn't necessarily mean that ticks the box for potential autism spectrum inclusion, right? It's just more of an age appropriate, maybe they have a fear response, right? Maybe something kind of happened in the past where they have become very weary of that particular behavior. And so they have kind of this avoidance of that behavior. So what I'm trying to impress upon you guys with these cut and dry diagnostic screening measures is that there are shades of gray built into this, and trying to disentangle those shades can be kind of daunting, right? So I want kind of people to be aware of that, just in terms of just what I'm showing you here in terms of some of the stuff. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics, you know, they have a lot of resources on this particular topic, as you might expect, all right? And what we start to see here is that pediatricians will kind of get into the brains of parents, and they will encourage them to seek screening between certain months of development if individuals express certain manifestations. So Brooke was asking a question, do you think that anything during a pregnancy could be something that adds to a child being diagnosed with autism? Yeah, I mean, as a scientist who understands, you know, the brain's development as a consequence of everything that the mother might do in utero or as part of the birthing process, something that maybe passes through the blood-brain or the umbilical barrier, I think that there are behaviors that have been shown to have profound effect on the likelihood of developing Alzheimer's, specifically drugs and alcohol. It's kind of amazing that drugs and alcohol are kind of our go-tos for psychiatric difficulties in infants that are born from a mother with that. So if I were a betting person going to Vegas, then I would say, yeah, I think there are some behaviors that a mother could do which might increase the chances of their child being born somewhere on the spectrum. But then, you know, as a realist, I want you guys to kind of think about the perspective of, okay, you know, you have some of these behaviors, but there is no cause and effect. How could you possibly have cause and effect? Because you can't test for cause and effect, right? You can't have a control group here or experimental group here, and let's just make sure these moms over here are swigging some Jack Daniels every night, and then let's make sure these moms over here are following, you know, the healthy diet and they're living a very clean life. And so my comment here is, yeah, we can see some things and we can start to notice some associations, but I think everybody in this chat group here would understand that associations do not equal causation. All right. So to Brooke's question, I would just say, yes, I as a scientist believe that there are certain behaviors and certain resulting conditions that can happen as a consequence of birth or in the birthing process that could increase the likelihood of neurological insult, therefore autism development and expression. But then I would say, as a realist, those things are kind of hard to test out and say, yes, this behavior causes this condition, if that makes sense, Brooke. Okay. One thing I want to say here is that most individuals receive a diagnosis before the age of 8. But then as I was talking to this small group at the high school, there were 3 individuals on that group that weren't diagnosed until middle school. All right. So there's a lot of reasons for, does someone get diagnosed or do they not get diagnosed? Again, think of this as a spectrum. If you have an individual who's on the nominal or milder side of the spectrum, what's considered normal child behavior versus what might be considered psychopathic behavior, right? So just because you have a parent who looks at a kid's behavior and says, this might be a tweak away from normal. Well, again, it just could be a stage issue. It doesn't necessarily have to say, yes, because they manifest this now, they are going to be at increased likelihood of developing autism. So again, I always tell my students, guys, take numbers and means and standard deviations and modes and medians with a grain of salt, all right? They just point towards certain trends. Understand the trends, but don't become slaves to the numbers. I'm always telling my students that. Why? Because numbers change, all right? So look at what the numbers are representing and then look at what they're starting to kind of clue into, if that makes sense. But just looking at, yeah, most statistically happen before the age of 8, all right? But yes, there are conditions under which they will happen certainly after. Now, there's a number of different things here that I want to kind of point out in terms of one of my favorite epidemiological words, which is called prevalence. For those that don't necessarily know, prevalence is the amount of existing cases of something in a population, right? So it's just, what is, like, it could be COVID. What is the amount of COVID in a given population? Or what is the amount of influenza in a particular population? So prevalence always indicates existing amounts of some disease, most likely, in a particular population. So here are a couple different slides that I want to call your attention to, but there's a couple trends here that I want to kind of point out. And I'm a believer in bolding certain things on slides to call people's visual attention to certain things. All right. One of the things that we're seeing is that there is an explosion in autism diagnosis, right? So I was reading on this today and I was just kind of going through some of the latest research, and there are 85, I believe, million people around this planet are actually on the spectrum somewhere, okay? So the numbers I'm giving you right here are numbers obtained through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And most of these numbers are kind of encompassing the United States and associated territories, but they're not necessarily reflective of the greater world population, right? One of the interesting facts that I discovered was that France has the lowest prevalence of autism, and that Japan and the other country was, I believe, it's on the tip of my tongue. I know Japan was tied with another country for the highest expression of autism, and I'll have to kind of come back to this. I'll have an aha moment in my brain here, and those neurons will finally connect. But what I'm trying to impress upon you here is that the prevalence of autism has exploded around the planet in recent years. In our country, we know that more boys than girls have been diagnosed as somewhere on the spectrum, right? So more boys than girls are afflicted by it, which also kind of begs the question to me as an inquiring mind that wants to know, okay, well, why would that be? And so I kind of come back to the Fragile X syndrome, right? And certain genetic alterations that maybe happen within the XY chromosome pairings and kind of some of the things there. And then I'm also thinking, well, one thing I know, and again, I haven't been a parent in terms of my own child, but I've seen it in my wife's children, is that boys and girls, like Karen is saying, they manifest different behaviors. And a lot of boys, their behaviors are very much out in people's faces. They are very much overt behaviors. The words they use, the things that they do, right? These are behaviors that people can objectively see, and they're kind of more out there. And so they're more able to be kind of clued into what I would argue than maybe females who might manifest the behavior in, let's say, quieter ways. Okay, so they're not as out there, they're not as in your face. All right, they're a little more on the softer side of expression. So I would say one possibility for that is that maybe parents recognize some of these problematic behaviors in boys more so than girls, because maybe of the way they manifest certain behaviors when they're on the younger side, right? So that's just something I kind of want to leave in your head here. And then the other thing that I kind of want to talk about as I flip the slide here, and I look at how autism has increased since 2000, and I want you guys to see here that the percentage increase runs anywhere from about 317% to 417%. So I want to just impress upon you that it's exploded in recent years since the 2000s. And the question becomes, why? The question becomes, okay, why is that the way? Why are we seeing that? Well, there's a number of different reasons, okay? And they could change from, the environment that people are raised in. They can kind of have everything to do with just the way their brains are developing and the way that they're kind of organizing. And then, again, are people coming forward or are they not? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and speed up a little bit here, just in terms of kind of the stuff I want to get to. So what is a biomarker? Biomarker is anything in the body that can be measured. So what science is doing now is trying to find biomarkers for autism. And the things that they're trying to do to develop these biomarkers is they're trying to look at body fluids, sample tissues, and imaging of the brain, and then physical measurements of things like the brain. Right. So they're trying to kind of look at changes in the body and changes in how the body does what the body does and look for these markers that could indicate autism. So the first thing I want you to know about autism, rather, is at present moment, there is very little understanding of this. It's a newly emerging research topic. All right. The other thing that we don't see with it is there's not a lot of comparison control groups. Right. So there's not a large body of individuals that we have access to their biomarkers and compare those individuals to controlled individuals and look at the biomarkers that those individuals might have. Again, biomarker are these biological things that can be measured in the body. So I want to just present a few to you guys real quick. And my fourth bullet point here is the accuracy coefficient. These are the ones right here that have over a 75% of variance in terms of ultimately developing autism. They include behavioral, genetic, immune, family, medical history, neuroimaging, nutritional, and neurophysiology. That just basically means how the brain does what the brain does. Okay, in terms of behavioral biomarkers, I've already kind of covered this a little bit. The most common behavioral biomarker are delayed language skills, delayed movement skills, all right, learning deficits, avoiding eye contact, told the story there, and then having hyperactive behavior. But again, I want you guys to see this. I hate to get kind of stuck on this point, but I want you to understand a lot of youth have hyperactive or impulsive behaviors. That's kind of what it means to be a young little person. All right. So what is the level of shade of gray there? When does hyperactive impulsive behavior become psychopathic versus normative for that age group? So behavioral biomarkers, I would argue, are a little bit kind of tricky. Okay. Because again, what's normative, what's not? 80% of the variation in autism is contributed to genetic factors. This is an important thing to know, all right? That 80% of the individuals who ultimately develop autism, the explanation of that has a lot to do with variations in their genetic markers. So I have a couple different things right here, right? The word methylation, what that just means is that there's different protein fragments that get combined in different ways within the messenger RNA and the DNA. So there you're just having kind of these nucleotide and protein kind of mishmashes where they don't normally go together very well. And that gets kind of manifested in terms of protein expression. Comorbidity with Down syndrome, we do see a lot of autism in Down's individuals. And again, if you test for Fragile X, where you see certain chromosomal anomalies on the X chromosome, nucleotide abnormalities on the X chromosome, then some of those things will express that as well. All right, so basically all this is saying here is that the genetic biomarkers are the foremost biomarker of exploration in establishing a link between what's being seen genetically and the ultimate expression of autism. Medical history biomarkers, right? These are the ones that I talked about previously. So if you have aged parents, right, advanced parental and maternal age, that would be a biomarker for potential autism. All right, if you have a family history of it, complications in delivery, and this goes back to the question someone asked previously, smoking, medications, internal bleeding, and gestational diabetes are specific types of medical conditions that have been associated, not causative, but they've been associated with increased prevalence of autism as well. So family history and genetics, I would argue, have kind of the biggest kind of percentage of variance. Neuroimaging, the thing I want to draw your attention to here is you can use this thing called a structural MRI, and this goes to brain mapping, which someone brought earlier on up into the conversational feed, the chat. And here what we're doing is something called a structural MRI, where we're lighting up certain areas metabolically of the brain. And the two things I want to call your attention to here is what we call our cortical surface area. Okay, so the brain has this neocortex that is, and you can see it on the scan there, the MRI scan. It's all these little folds of the brain, the gyri and the sulci, if you know those words. So the idea is that the cortical surface area in autistic individuals is has a 94% accuracy rate in screening for autism. And what that means is autistic individuals have less cortical surface area compared to age matched controls. That's what I want you to see there, is they have less cortical surface area comparatively with a healthy developing brain. Brain volume, what we're talking about here is basically the density of the brain, right? So we're talking about the weight and the density of brain. So the brain development of autistic kids or autistic life forms, autistic individuals, okay, that it's going to have less volume than a healthy age match control, right? So less cortical surface area by association and less brain volume are neuroimaging biomarkers that have received a lot of attention kind of recently. And then genetic expression abnormalities have the highest accuracy rate in screening for autism spectrum disorder. All right, so looking at the genetic biomarkers, looking at the XY chromosomes, and looking at how they express genes, if they look at those genetic abnormalities, those have the highest accuracy rate in linking causation. But again, it's more of an association, not causation. The last thing I have here are metabolic biomarkers. And what the people have done here is they've looked at mitochondrial abnormalities and how does the mitochondria, the energy production centers of the cell, you know, how do those things function? What is the amount of them? And what they found is that in autistic individuals, there are mitochondrial abnormalities in terms of production of glucose, production of energy, all right, utilization of creatine and the metabolism of creatine. And you also see amino acid imbalances and fatty acid imbalances. So there are some metabolic markers as well, biomarkers of autism that people are exploring. What I want to do is I want to get into the psychology and the sociology real quick. I apologize for my time here, but I want to go ahead and give some attention to two things that I think are tremendously important. After we get over the prevalence and the biomarkers from autism, I want to kind of focus on some of the social and cultural aspects of autism. So right now, I kind of want you guys to envision this triangle, all right? And at the vertices of all 3 points in this triangle, you have these different kinds of autism-related constructs that are currently being kind of put together and combined to reflect an autistic individual, all right? And reflect what cultures and society are looking at in terms and identifying as an autistic individual. So one of the things that we're starting to see is research focusing on the evolution of the term autism. Right? How do we label individuals? How do we not label individuals? How does labeling an individual manifest in terms of their self-confidence and their, in this particular case, academic performance? Right? How are we establishing and refining social support? How are we getting individuals who have been defined as being somewhere on the spectrum, how are we giving them the psychological, the medical support, the clinical support that they need to go ahead and grow and develop? And then redefining, the third point is redefining a personhood. So if you have an autistic individual, all right, how do you not label the person as an autistic? And therefore labeling, I think a lot of us in here would understand that labeling along any sphere of life can have a limiting factor in how an individual perceives themselves and their potential in the world around them, right? So one of the things that we're kind of going to talk about just really quickly is redefining what it means to be labeled as autistic. So what does the term autism mean within cultures? How are we developing support mechanisms for autistic individuals? And how are we not losing the sense of self within an individual with autism, if that makes sense to you? A couple different movements that we call cultural paradigms. These are areas that a lot of sociologists are focusing on now when it comes to autism. One is called the neurodiversity movement. And what that says, just really quickly, is that brains change over time. No brain metabolizes, is structurally built, and ultimately manifests behavioral responses the same way. All right, every brain basically is different. All right, and that genetics play a role in that. So according to this neurodiversity movement, autism spectrum disorders are what we call natural variants, right? They're not pathological variants. It's just brains change. So these are changed brains. It's not good or bad. It just is, all right? And it's a natural variance of human evolution. Therefore, we should treat it as a natural evolution of humans, right? So not just labeling there, but understanding that brains change as they develop. And every brain is unique. Every brain is different. So neurodiversity just means difference. That's what I tell my students, D for diversity, D for different. All right, so the idea here is that, yes, we're not kind of looking at this from more of a stigmatized approach, but understanding that brains develop uniquely. And unique brain development is not a bad thing. Okay, the other one is more what we call the pathology paradigm. And what this means basically is, yeah, well, pathology refers to illness. So here we have more of an illness perspective that autistics have these things called deficits in the brain's functioning. All right, so things the brain isn't doing that causes behaviors to become manifested. So one says brain development is very much kind of accepted and different, and that's okay. One says that certain development is more indicative of a pathology or a brain issue. Okay, so what I want you guys to take away from this is that when you look around the world at autism, what we're seeing is this neurodiversity movement saying that, yes, brains change, it's a natural part of evolution, and we're not going to develop negative connotations of those unique brains as they change. The other one from the pathology spectrum says, no, there are certain ways that brains change that are metabolically imbalanced that can lead to different types of behavioral and verbal and nonverbal problems. So these are the two sociological movements that we see now from researchers, right? And I just want to kind of impress upon you guys that we're kind of getting to there. So one of the things I want to look at with autism and learning, and now we're in the last couple of minutes of the presentation, and I want to kind of focus more on the learning context. And I think a lot of us in here are aware of this, that there are many different learning styles of our students, right? And I think a talented teacher can speak to different learning styles and teach within different learning styles. So the three that I have seen the most in my travels as a professor, teacher, and tutor is that you have something called visual learners, right? And they process visual stimulation coming back into their brains and then interacting with that visual processing of information. You have what we call auditory learners, who learn best by listening and converting spoken word into memory. And then you have obviously kinesic or physical learners. And these are people who have to learn by doing, moving their body through space and time. So if you overlay autism on top of learning styles, and in particular these three, then you can understand that, well, being somewhere on the spectrum might have certain issues within all these learning spheres, all right? But if we're looking at learning and how it affects autism, not how autism affects learning, right? right? That's top down. But if we look from bottom up, how learning can be affected by autism, then research has shown us that, if I have an autistic people and they are physical learners, they're going to have certain challenges. If they are autistic individuals and they are visual learners, they're going to have specific challenges. So what this slide is all about doing is looking at this concept of autism, how it can be affected by learning process, but then how these learning processes can be and affect an autistic brain. So what I wanted to do here is just kind of overlay autism with the prominent learning styles. All right, so going on, we have a couple other different types of learners right here. We have what we call verbal learners, learn best by writing and presenting, logical, social, and solitary learners. I was always a solitary learner. Most autistic individuals that I've talked to are solitary learners. They learn a little bit more on their own. Okay, challenges for learning in autistics. These are some of the individual challenges that they have. They have nonverbal skills deficits. Again, they have communication issues. They lack focus, right? They have cognitive disorders. They have developmental delays, and they have narrowed intellectual interests. So I'm going to go ahead and tie this up, hopefully, guys, in the next 5 minutes or so. All right, techniques to improve learning among autistic kids. There's a whole list of them here. This is based on my research. And the thing that I want to kind of impress upon the remaining people here in the presentation is you have to identify the type of learner that an autistic person on the spectrum is, and then you have to develop pedagogical techniques within that learning sphere, right? So if you have a visual autistic learner, obviously you want to incorporate visual aids, and you want to use something called a picture exchange communication system, all right? If you have an individual who engages in repetitive learning activities and they're a kinesic learner, that's going to and they learn by putting their body in time, space, and doing, then engaging in repetitive learning activities will be something that will kind of tick that as well, okay? Again, but one of the things that learning also does is it tries to teach social skills. Well, if you have an individual learning style, then using social skill development techniques might not be the most effective thing to do with an autistic individual. Okay, so as I said at the bottom of the slide there, it's very much grade and content specific. All right, this is just an example of picture exchange communication, and this is in the mind of an autistic. I can say the word ball, but in the brain of an autistic, they can't convert the word ball into an image of a ball. So the idea here is you just show them a ball and their brain can connect the dots. Oh, grab your iPad. Okay, well, my brain in the autistic sense doesn't know, I can't connect iPad with a specific type of machine, but if you can exchange a picture for that word, then their brains can kind of deal with that a little bit better. Last part of this today, so thanks for hanging with me, is I want to talk about techniques in higher education, right? I want to talk about some opportunities and techniques that we have within the college population and the college setting. One of the things that we know about autistic individuals is autism accounts for roughly 12% of the academic variance and academic progress, right? So if you have autistic students, not only do they have a higher amount of dropouts compared to non-autistics, all right, but the severity of their autism can account for 12% of their ultimate progress and their ultimate academic performance, which I think is a fairly substantial amount. All right. In our college students, research on autistic college students indicates that they lack what they call executive functioning. All right. It's just creating higher order concepts and connecting higher order concepts. Cognitive inflexibility. They've learned a certain thing and they don't want to consider an opposing view. They don't want to consider an opposing mechanism of how something works. All right. And then obviously working memory, short-term, long-term memory. Working memory is short-term memory. So here, the short-term memory of autistic brains might have certain limitations. So we have to kind of take that into account as academicians as well. Last couple of slides I want to leave you guys with are just some oriented academic techniques that might help what I call catalyze or help develop learning experiences. So, the thing here is, and I'm not going to focus on all of these right here, but one of the first things that we need to do is treat autism as an identity, not as a medical condition. So get more into the neurodiversity pool and swim less in the pathology pool. All right. So the idea here is you want to seek confirming labels, all right, just like you would in other realms of life. And the confirming label is, think about that more as on the positive side instead of the negative or the restrictive side. Okay, promote students' disability service. Every college, every university has this. All right. And one of the things that my wife and I do as professors is we very much utilize our disability services. And we do so in a way where we want the best for our individual students. And if we think that going down that pathway can help with that process, then we have no problems at all referring to students with disability services. I want to just kind of leave you guys with this right here. And this is just something that as a college professor, I've kind of learned to do. And autistics struggle with sensory environments. They struggle with sounds. They struggle with certain color intensities, certain light intensities. So, we have to kind of understand that that could be an academic barrier in terms of the sensory environments and the stimulation coming into an autistic brain. So when we are considering educating in that realm, we might want to be mindful of things like lighting, mindful of things like the volume of sound. We want to use concrete, specific, plain language. So one of the things that we become guilty of is teaching by analogy, all right? Autistics have a hard time with analogy. They have a hard time with this concept representing this this particular thing, or this anecdote representing this concept. All right. So one of the things that they say with autistic individuals is to use concrete examples. This is this. This has been shown to be related to that. Okay. Computer-aided real-time transcription services. This is just this right here. Autistic students in colleges do really well if they can have information transcribed to them and get away from the whole note-taking perspective and actually have the notes provided for them at some later time that they can interact with. I want to just show you guys an example of that. And an important one here is something called stimming. And that is understanding that autistic individuals, because they have repetitive behaviors, many of them, we have to understand that we would like to establish an environment in higher education where they don't feel kind of victimized, or they don't feel kind of devalued by doing some of these behaviors. So we might allow certain freedom of movement. We might allow them to do some of these repetitive behaviors in an environment, in a classroom environment that maybe isn't distracting to other people, but it validates them as students and the need for them to continue doing some of these things that they do to kind of dissipate some of their energy. Conclusions. All right, so let me go ahead and kind of go through this just real quick. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to fuse some science with some epidemiology, with some psychology, with some sociology, right? That was kind of my vision for this presentation. My students would be the first to tell you sometimes I can be a little bit more on the verbose side, but I eventually find my way to the finish line. The idea with this presentation is I wanted to explore some of the biological underpinnings. And what I would like you guys to take away from that is that there are a grouping of biomarkers that have been that are being researched, and they are used as screening devices for higher and lower probabilities of developing autism. But the two most valid and reliable in terms of these biomarkers are genetic and actually familial. All right. So what happens at the level of having aged parents? What happens at the level of the developing child? And those two realms right there, genetics and more on the familial side, relatives with autism, that type of thing, those are the things that carry the most variance. The social cultural undercurrents of autism here, I talked a little bit more about neurodiversity and talked a little bit more about the pathology paradigms. So these two cultural paradigms is what I wanted to present to everybody, in that the cultural theory, the cultural research is pointing to neurodiversity as this is just a normal expression of brain development. The pathological paradigm is no, autism is in fact a neurodegenerative disease, and we have to kind of treat it as such. And so there's some connectivity, and people are trying to kind of disentangle some of the connectivity between those two sociological approaches. All right. How is autism affected by different learning styles? So I talked a little bit about some learning styles and how autism can affect those learning styles, and then consequently how those learning styles can affect autism. All right. So I kind of want to hit on that a little bit. And then some challenges and opportunities for higher education and education generally. All I want to impress upon you here is that obviously we know this. People don't learn the same way and in the same way. So as teachers, as researchers, as professors, as students, we need to kind of dial into how we and others learn. And we're talking about autism. We need to understand that the autistic brain learns in very specific ways, depending on the level on the spectrum. And we need to be aware of the ways in which those brains learn. All right. And there are certain techniques that might help with the learning process for those brains. Okay. So normally here is where I would open this up to some question and answer real quick. I know this is being actually recorded, I believe. So I'll go ahead and stick around. I ran about, I don't know, 3 to 10, 13 minutes longer. If you want to go ahead and type a few things into the chat, some questions, I'll go ahead and address those. But I want to really sincerely thank you guys for kind of hanging out with me for an hour or so and kind of talking a little bit about autism. And hopefully I gave you some different perspectives on this and some things that you can take away from this in terms of an increased awareness or knowledge of autism as a unique situation. All right. Thanks so much, guys.